for the sake of time here. So we have a fantastic panel of 4, and I'm going to give them somewhat abbreviated introductions here so we have a little bit more time. So Mabel Berezin is a comparative sociologist at Cornell. Her work has explored the intersection of political institutions and cultural meanings with an emphasis on challenges to democratic cohesion and solidarity in Europe and the United States. She's author of several books, including Making the Fascist Self, The Political Culture of Interwar Italy, Illiberal Politics in Neoliberal Times, Culture, Society, and Populism in the New Europe, and with Martin Shane, Europe Without Borders, Remapping Territories, Citizenship, and Identity in a Transnational Age. Then we have Andrea Kendall-Taylor. She is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Andrea is an expert on autocracies, Russian disinformation, and the national security challenges facing the United States, Europe, and the Transatlantic Alliance. She served for 8 years as a senior intelligence officer from 2015 to 2018. She was also Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She's an adjunct professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And I'll just say she received her BA from the politics department at Princeton. So we especially welcome her. Then Andy Moravcsik. Andy is a professor of politics and director of the European Union program at Princeton. He's also director of the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination. He is the author of many publications on European integration, international relations theory, qualitative historical methods, human rights, international law and organization, and other topics as well. So his books include Power, Independence, and Non-State Actors in World Politics, Europe Without Illusions, and The Choice for Europe, Social Purpose and State Power from Messina to Maastricht. Then we have Torrey Toussig. Torrey is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution Center on the United States and Europe. She's also research director of the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship, and also research director of the American Secretaries of State Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. Her areas of expertise include transatlantic relations, great power competition, and authoritarian challenges to democratic states and institutions. So we're just going to go in the order that the alphabetical order that the speakers were listed. So we'll start with Mabel.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very stimulating event. In pulling together my remarks for today, it struck me how different some of my comments on this subject are from the various talks that I gave on populism a mere 2 years ago when I was visiting at Princeton. The landscape has moved swiftly in some regards, and in other ways, it's also remarkably stable. So I'm going to try to, in 5 minutes, highlight both the stabilities and first, point 1, the title of the panel, Emergent Populism and Fascism. First point, it's not emergent. What is being called populism has been around for a long time, and it began accelerating probably around 2000, and I say probably, but it is of course not the same populism that we have today that we had in 2000. It has evolved, and there have been changes in response to exogenous events of all stripes. Now, why is this point important? Because I'm enough of a historian to argue that we cannot ask the correct analytic questions as to where we are going if we don't have some idea of where we have been. Now, with regard to the nationalist right, which is my preferred term for all of these various groups and parties, trajectory matters, and also inflection points. And what I mean by inflection points are moments where things change. Over the years, even over 20 years or 21 years, there have been multiple inflection points in the trajectory of European populism. But for present purposes, even though there was an explosion of interest in 2016 after Trump and Brexit, the key inflection year for me and for Europe is 2015, the triple crisis year, as I call it. And it's the austerity crisis, mainly in Greece, the terror crisis in France, and the refugee crisis in Germany. Now, these are all trans-European crises, and they hit different countries differently, which is why I'm associating countries with them. And any of these crises should or could have been managed at the EU level. And I hate to make a comment about EU governance with Andy on the panel, but I will anyway. And it seems to me that a lot of these various crises are still in various forms lingering on like a sort of festering toothache. And I was particularly taken with the comments of Justin Guest in this regard. Second, about the nationalist right, I'm still on point one here. It's not one thing. There are many variations and shades of ideological orientations as there are countries. Orban is not Le Pen. Recently on a populist blog that I read, a blog about populism, a political scientist in the interest of clarity offered 7 categories and 95 parties that we had to take into account if we want to understand populism. So that doesn't seem very clear to me. Now, while there is admittedly much difference among these parties, what they do share is an antipathy to EU as a source of governance and national problem solving. They also, of course, share an antipathy to immigrants and xenophobia, but I think that's a little bit more complicated an issue for this particular format. So, all right, so that's point one. They've been around a long time. They're very different. Point two, COVID. COVID seems to me a tipping point phenomenon. It is, and it seems to me a phenomenon that is fraught with political ironies. The first is one of the first things everyone did a year ago when COVID came, where borders were tightened. By this November, as a meeting on multilateralism and global recovery, Macron, Merkel, and von der Leyen issued a statement saying that the resurgence of nationalism and protectionism was a major challenge. Global action, this has been a recurrent public argument for a long time, and it became more salient since 2017 when Marine Le Pen laid down the gauntlet against globalists as the enemy of the 21st. Could have done was handle vaccine distribution. And from all the research and the studies that I've read about it, they have not done this very effectively, to put it mildly. And certainly Macron is in a lot of trouble in France because of his handling of vaccines and COVID. Now, the problem with vaccine distribution at the EU level is that it feeds into a longstanding populist narrative that the EU acts against Europe. And suddenly we have a case where perception and reality are suddenly in sync. Now, we could take this in the discussion period, but I think COVID did a lot to do in Trump. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to work yet in Europe. Point three, in spring 2022, we will have the French presidential election. And this will be the bellwether election for nationalist right politics in Europe, as Marine Le Pen prepares to run again for the 3rd time. 2 years ago, I would have said that it was impossible for Marine Le Pen to ever win a French presidential election, even if she continues to be a force in French politics. But this time, I think it is really different. While I would not predict a sure win, she will come close again, and that she will come closer in the 2nd round if she gets to the 2nd round, which she probably will, and that may be enough. And I've been following every French presidential election far too closely since 2002. The polls are already starting, and she's ahead of or tied with Macron. And the French polls are already starting, and she's ahead of or tied with Macron consistently, running as high as 27% at some points. And she's way ahead of just about every other candidate that's thrown themselves into the ring. Okay, so I want to say some reasons why I think this time it will be different for Le Pen, and why that will be important for Europe. First of all, she is a skilled politician. If you've been following her for as long as I have, She's moved center-right on many issues. For example, whether you find it a good argument or not, she said the other day that she's giving up she's not going to run as president of the National Assembly. She's going to run as president for all the people in France. So she's playing a little word game there. Her lowest public moment, obviously, was her television debate in 2017 with Macron, where he more or less eviscerated her on the subject of macroeconomic policy. But I doubt that anything like that will be repeated because she's someone who actually learns lessons. She has given up on Brexit, which was one of her calling cards for a while, as most of the European right has, because they say, or she says, that EU now respects nations more, so she can be in EU. In addition, many events have moved in her favor. She described Macron's COVID policy and then the vaccine rollout as a failure, as his Waterloo. And indeed, this isn't a hard thing it's not hard to criticize Macron in France. He's widely unpopular, even among those who had supported him in 2017. Political alternatives have evaporated, and this is more or less the same across Europe, although with different, the calibrations are different. But it's particularly extreme in France. There's no viable left, center-right is shaky. And there are many people so far who've declared themselves ready to run at least for the first round. But I think most importantly, in 2022, the shame of voting for Le Pen, which was something that permeated the political culture and the cultural in general for the past 20 years. It was like considered a national disaster when her father got to the second round, has really, I won't say evaporated, but it is much weaker than it had been. And indeed, the constituency for right-wing politics or nationalist right politics has changed. It's not a sort of odd, few anymore. And some of that has been driven by a lot of the social and political problems, which have been discussed in various ways in this conference, that have actually sort of made some parts of her message seem more practical and potentially problem solving than they might have sounded even 5 years ago. Now, when I was doing this talk, I didn't really have an end for it. And I don't have an end for it. I'm going to end it there because the questions are just so, I've thrown out some almost verbal tweets. There's so many questions before us, and I'm going to leave it. So thank you.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time to get into some of these things. So hopefully. So let's turn it over to Andrea.
Great. Well, I'll take this in a slightly different direction. So I chose to focus my comments more on how right-wing populism will affect the European security picture. And just as a starting point, it's a difficult question, I think, to answer in large part because there's not, at least to my knowledge, extensive research that addresses the link between the right-wing populism and security and defense. And I would say, kind of looking at the broad landscape, as of right now, at this moment in time, it does not appear that that right-wing populism has substantially undermined European security and defense. And if anything, 2014 in Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and subsequent occupation of Eastern Ukraine has really served as a catalyst for NATO and the reprioritization of European security. And so since then, many of the trends have been moving in the right direction, despite the uptick in support for right-wing parties in Europe. Defense spending is increasing, greater US and Western presence in the Baltics, and so on. So as of right now, I think it hasn't had a substantial impact, but this is my really important but and where I want to focus my remarks. I think there's a couple of theoretical reasons to believe that the persistence and especially any growth in support for right-wing populists could erode European security. So I'm going to make just 3 points on how we might think about the connection between those two groups and a degraded security environment. So the first point is that right-wing populism is associated with the fragmentation of the political landscape, which makes consensus hard. And so today, right-wing parties are present in a large share of European parliaments, and that is, along with populism also on the left, but the growth of populism both on the right and the left is fragmenting politics. And so in places like Spain, where you had Vox and Podemos, That transformed, traditionally had that two-party system to one where there are now 5 parties. A similar picture in Germany with the rise of the AfD and Die Linke, and that's contributed to the diffusion of power across, I don't know what it stands at now, but about 7 parties in the Bundestag. Netherlands at one point in time also had 13 parties in their parliament. And so I think the point is that with populist parties, even when they're not in the majority, they are splintering the political party system, which makes governing more difficult. And it impedes countries' ability to unite around a common vision or reach consensus. And that's important, maybe just to give an example. So even right now, as we speak, Russian troops are accumulating on the border of Ukraine. And so if NATO wanted to address this, they could, for example, send up their AWACS, which is the Airborne Warning and Control System, or they could try to send some other signal to Moscow. But that would require consensus. And if you have multiple parties involved at the national level, then it can derail consensus. It's just too many veto players, and that impedes the consensus that NATO needs to move forward and uphold security. The second point that could link the right-wing populism and weakened security is nationalism. And we do see right-wing populism is associated with nationalism, which again can make consensus hard, and it can undermine the deterrent effect of collective defense. So populism, right-wing populism, it's a thin ideology. And because it's amorphous, then you see populist leaders often drawing on other ideologies like nationalism. So you often see right-wing populism appearing in combination with nationalism. And so in the foreign policy realm, that means then that nationalists are advocating policies that put the nation first at the expense of their relationships with other countries. And that is obviously a problem also for collective defense. So we can think even in the case of the United States with President Trump, he called into question US commitment to NATO, and he pondered out loud whether the United States would want to go to war to defend a country like Montenegro. And so I think there's 3 problems there, 3 challenges to security and defense. One is consensus. So if you're putting your country first, it can derail consensus, which is required in the NATO context. 2, again, is that point about countries putting their own individual national interests first. And we already have an example, or there probably are many, but one from last year, Turkey on the eve of the NATO summit threatened to block a key defense plan to protect the Baltic states and Poland against Russian aggression, unless NATO backed its own recognition of the Kurdish People's Protection Units as terrorists. And so they're, again, putting a country's interests first at the risk of taking more collective decisions. And then 3rd is that nationalism undermines the deterrent effect of collective defense. And here you think about Russia. Putin in particular very much understands asymmetry of interest. And we have seen regularly that he's willing to take his riskiest actions when he understands that Russia simply cares more than the United States or NATO. And so if you have member states that may be signaling that they're not willing to act to defend others, it can create an environment that's more permissive for Russian aggression. Maybe Russia then decides it wants to gamble that any response will be weak. And then the final point, I think, linking right-wing populism and the security environment is that populism creates vulnerabilities that external actors like Russia and China can exploit. And so we also know that right-wing populism is polarizing. So it's this idea about pitting the pure people against the corrupt elite. And it amplifies divisions about who even constitutes the people. And those are divisions, societal fissures that countries like Russia and China can seek to exploit. They also, and especially this is the case when you have populist leaders who are in power, those populist leaders are often seeking to dismantle institutions that stand in their way of executing or fulfilling, their ability to advance the people's will. So they're going after courts. They're making courts more pliant, weakening the rule of law, weakening the media environment. And those, again, are vulnerabilities that external actors, Russia and China in particular, can exploit. And so in this case, when we're thinking about right-wing populism and security, we also have to have kind of a broader conception or definition of what security is. It's much more in today's day and age. It's more than just a military matter. And as another example there, for Hungary is moving forward by putting Huawei in its systems. And that then creates risks to NATO interoperability. It could create espionage risks. And so when you have populists who are doing things, again, putting national interests first, it does create risks and vulnerabilities for NATO. So I will wrap up there, but I think really the bottom line from my perspective is that now national politics matter a great deal for consensus, and that really is the bedrock of collective defense. And these right-wing populist parties and movements create multiple risks that we could see over time erode European security and defense.
Great, thanks. Andy?
Great, thanks. Well, Andrea set this up well by saying there are no systematic studies of the foreign and security policy impact of right-wing nationalist parties. It's true to an amazing degree. I'm currently involved in a cross-national research project on exactly that. 28 countries, that is to say the EU, 27 plus Britain, across 30 issues. And what we find is that these parties have surprisingly little impact on foreign policy. I can't go through all the issues, but one example which Mabel mentioned is EU withdrawal or Brexit follow-ons. They were well over a dozen parties 5 years ago who favored that. Now there are only two insignificant parties in Europe. There's nobody who favors pulling out of NATO. So with a few exceptions, almost everything these parties try to do, even when they get in office, is either very moderate or irrelevant. They are all in all more bark than bite. And the interesting question is why? And I think here it's basic political science. So number one, there aren't very many populist parties out there that get a lot of votes. So over half the European societies don't have a right-wing populist party that can poll in double digits. And only a half a dozen have one that can poll in the 20s or above. And this number is stable or declining at this point. No party's ever gotten a majority of votes. So their big issue is, how do I get to 50% support so I can have some impact on policy or on government? The answer, as it was for Trump, is you ally with much more pragmatic, economically oriented conservatives to form a government. And that moderates anything that you try to do. And you can see that clearly in the case of Hungary and Poland, where you have countries that are highly economically dependent on EU investment, trade, and aid, and are exceptionally pro-European in public opinion. So if you want to rule, you can say things, but doing things that actually has a major impact is much harder. Second problem is, suppose you do get some votes, then in most countries you have to govern in a coalition. So you have lots of examples of this in Austria, Estonia, Finland, and these parties basically get eviscerated. They're single issue foreign policy parties. It's migration, which at this point is a consensual issue in Europe de facto. So most of the other people, and they come in, they usually in office for a short period of time because they say or do something that gets them kicked out. And they don't have a lot of impact. I talked to the person who was essentially running the last Austrian coalition of two, including the extreme right, who said, yeah, they came into office and we said, we agree with you on migration and we'll give you some civil service jobs so you can keep your boys happy. And otherwise, just let us handle the policy. And that's more or less the way it works if you're a minority coalition member from one of these parties. You have to get other people to accept your policies. And the only way really to do that is to be the dominant party in the coalition. There are 4 examples of that: Britain, Hungary, Poland, and the US outside of our set. And if you ask yourself, why these countries? The answer has a lot to do with the electoral system. These are countries with majoritarian electoral systems in which you can get less than 50% of the vote and over 50% of the representation, and thereby govern with less constraint. But, and that suggests that that can't happen a lot of other places because there aren't a lot of other countries that have majoritarian electoral systems, except interestingly France. So, but even in those countries, suppose you get in and you really are sitting pretty domestically, like Hungary, Polish government, I mean, Orban, Kaczynski, then you have to convince other countries to go along with what you're doing in foreign policy. It's a lot harder to move the needle in foreign policy than in domestic policy because there's another level of negotiation with everybody else in NATO, everybody else in the EU, the United States, everybody else in the WTO, and so on. And it is flatly impossible for any country but the US, and unthinkable for any country except the US and the UK to pull this off. As we read, and was mentioned just now, as we read in the newspapers this week, right-wing parties don't even agree with each other, let alone with other people. So it is impossible to get a consensus behind very much, except an issue that's completely consensual de facto in Europe, which is restricting migration. So this is the main reason why a leader like Orban or Kaczynski has never breathed a word about pulling out of the EU, pulling out of NATO, or any of this radical stuff. What they are is masters of symbolic shtick. So these are guys who love to bark, but then not bite, right? They tell you that we oppose NATO, this and that, and they cast a decisive veto for which they make sure the press is there to see it, vetoing one trip of the NATO Secretary General to Ukraine, and then let everything else, all the practical assistance and everything, go forward. And we've interviewed a bunch of people who are in the policymaking positions in various societies that have to deal with Hungary, and this is the consensus view about how they work. So conclusion is what? If you're an ambitious right-wing populist, you face a very simple choice. You can moderate or you can become irrelevant. And so what you see is that people like Salvini and Le Pen, who are ambitious, moderate like crazy. They were against being in the EU, they were against being in the EMU, they were critics of NATO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they were also flirting with Nazi rhetoric. And the cost of being a player is to get rid of that rhetoric. The people who maintain some kind of crazy rhetoric are either minority parties that don't last long, like in Estonia, or they never get into office at all.
Great, thanks. Torrey?
Thank you, Mark. It's been really interesting to hear the remarks of the previous panelists, and it's interesting to hear the different takes and angles that each of us are bringing to this prompt. I think my comments perhaps dovetail best off of Andrea's in the way that she looked at kind of this all-encompassing approach to security challenges, or I guess non-traditional security challenges that the transatlantic relationship faces. And what I'll do just in a few minutes is try to draw out some links between what I see as two defining elements of international politics facing the transatlantic relationship today. That is, on the one hand, the rise of populism, illiberalism, and indeed global authoritarianism on the one hand, and the second, kind of this resurgent framework of great power competition. I mean, these are two big elements of the way, at least I think the United States looks at the international security environment, and it's one that I think affects Europe reality more and more, even though both of these realities have been growing for a number of years. So to bring these two kind of big picture issues together, I think we could ask the question, how do far right parties enhance the external challenges that US and Europe face from Russia and China? I pose that question. That does not mean that there is a clear or straightforward answer to it, and surely not one that we can answer in a few minutes, but I'll outline a few ways in which I think the far right are enhancing the authoritarian challenges we see from Russia and China within our own societies. First, I think we just have to acknowledge that the concurrent nature of both the internal and external challenges facing transatlantic democracies is making everything more difficult. I mean, there's no escaping the fact that Europe is at the center of these two defining trends in international politics today: renewed great power competition and the resurgence of global authoritarianism happening indeed within the borders of the EU. So In recent years, yeah, and again, I don't want to draw too many broad brushstrokes, but I think we can say that both Russia and China, through differing means and with differing strengths, seek to achieve three objectives. One is to develop military and economic spheres of influence in their own regions. In Russia's case, this involves Europe. Second, more globally, to weaken democratic institutions and norms that challenge their own internal legitimacy, something that Ambassador McFaul spoke to this morning. And third is to diminish Western dominance of the international order. And at the same time that Russia and China are carrying out these efforts and more actively doing so, Europe's newer democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, but also its more long-established democracies, such as in France, as Mabel talked about, are also seriously challenged by far-right populists and illiberal actors. And there are so many different ways to define the populist challenge. Mabel rightly said there is no one characteristic or clear way to do so, but one way that I define the illiberal challenge we see in Europe is that liberal principles, so political ideas that espouse the importance of individual liberties, minority rights, the separation of power, and levers across government, are being pulled apart from democratic institutions. So processes that translate popular will into public policy through legitimate elections. That's one way to define the illiberal challenge. So how is this concurrent resurgence of illiberalism, that we are seeing in Hungary and Poland and Turkey and in other countries within political parties, parliaments, even if not at the head of government, how is that interacting with authoritarian influence we're seeing from Russia and China? So in the case of Russia, I think these instances have been quite clear, and the links are relatively direct in specific settings. So on the one hand, we see pretty direct political contributions from Russian actors to far-right candidates such as Marine Le Pen in the French 2017 elections, financial support for the Leave campaign and Brexit from Russian actors. And then also today, I think just pretty clear political support and allegiances between illiberal actors such as Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin. And I think sometimes in populist conversations I'm a part of, we think about Vladimir Putin as like the father of illiberalism in Europe and the entity to which many illiberal actors turn to for that kind of ideological guidance. So that's one. I mean, I do think we see some direct links between Russian influence and illiberal actors in Europe. The second, in addition to these channels of direct support, are actually just domestic environments that are both enabling illiberal leaders at the same time that they are enabling external authoritarian influence. So what do I mean by this? This has come up a few times today, but for example, societies that are rife with misinformation, the repression of civil society, the removal of free and open media that are created and enhanced by and perhaps promoted by illiberal leaders, this also creates more space for external disinformation to grow and prosper. I mean, we've even seen this in the 2016 and even 2020 elections. In the United States, where misinformation is growing, we're more open and vulnerable to misinformation from the outside as well. Second, societies that maintain high levels of corruption also allow for greater external authoritarian influence. Again, the links in the Russian case perhaps are a bit clearer, where corruption tends to grow in areas of poor rule of law under illiberal leaders. This is also where we see Russian kleptocracy, money laundering grow as well. And then finally, I think there's the simple fact that illiberalism in Europe simply makes Russia's goals easier to achieve, namely to weaken the liberal democratic model, make democracy look messy, undermine democratic norms and European cohesion. I mean, these are goals that Russia has, that China has to a certain extent, and that I think illiberal actors are making easier, even if not carried out in tandem. So shifting more to the China side of the authoritarian challenge, again, I'm not trying to draw too broad of brushstrokes, but I think when we look at great power competition today, particularly from Washington, we look at it in the context of the challenges that Russia and China pose to a liberal democratic West. And in China, I think when it comes to Chinese authoritarian influence, it's a really complex picture. There is no illiberal ideological alignment that we see between some of these movements in Europe and the kind of conservative nationalism from Russia. Instead, where I think we can see illiberalism in Europe aiding some of China's goals, even if it's indirectly, is through fragmentation. This is something that Andrea brought up. And fragmentation can play into China's hands and goals. So divisions in Europe, even if not driven by populists, inhibit Europe from speaking with one voice against, for example, Chinese human rights violations and aggressions. We've seen certain EU member states, namely Greece and Hungary, both recipients of Chinese investment, a watered down language from the EU on Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, EU statements on Chinese human rights violations. So fragmentation does help, I think, prevent a united front from speaking out against Chinese transgressions where we might see more cohesion. I also think fragmentation enhances the ability of China to secure its economic interests. China prefers to work bilaterally with countries where it can maintain greater economic weight, and also through multilateral platforms like the 17+1. So anytime that China doesn't have to work with a united Europe, I think it actually serves Chinese economic interests. And then the final point I'll make on the China front is that and this is less so in COVID times, but in pre-COVID times, when I would travel to Hungary or Poland, you would hear anti-EU parties or populist parties point to China and say, look, we have friends that we can call in to build a new railroad or to work on infrastructure. And so we don't need structural funds from Brussels. I think that's bluffing, but China was this kind of rhetorical model that populists could say, we're not overly reliant on Brussels or the EU. We have other friends, actors we can turn to if you're going to be overly critical of our internal politics. China doesn't care about our internal politics. And so there was this kind of symbiotic relationship. And this is the final point I'll make. I think what we're seeing now, which even complicates the relationship between populists in China, is that they tend to be anti-globalist and protectionist in their economic agendas. That does not serve China's interests well. And we've also seen right-wing parties in Europe that tended to be pretty pro-China, like in Italy, turned starkly away from China in the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is where we might see governments move even further away from aligning with or siding with China. I mean, we of course saw this with President Trump, borderline xenophobic in his approach toward China during the pandemic. Nigel Farage, right after the Brexit referendum ended, tweeted out that stopping China is the next big battle to fight. I mean, I think that populists are now starting to see China as a way to appeal to the masses, particularly at a time when the public is perhaps more anti-China than it was in the past due to the pandemic. So I think time will tell whether far-right populism in Europe turns out to be a good or a bad thing for China's ability to enhance its influence in Europe, but it's certainly complex. It's not as clear as it is in the Russia case and those instances I brought up. But aside from where this goes in the China instances, I do think, and here's where I'll close, that the emergence of illiberal parties, illiberal governments within the EU and within NATO is presenting first and foremost a challenge to Western collective action, Western unity, transatlantic cooperation in an era, in a time when Russia and China are testing the bounds of not just our cohesion, but of fundamentally the liberal democratic model.
Fantastic. You all did a great job of both covering a variety of things and also keeping it succinct. So that leaves us some time for questions. Let me be the first one to throw one out. The rise of illiberal governments, democratic backsliding, it's been talked about, but I would like to know a little bit more about what you think the policies of the United States and the European Union should be towards democratic backsliding and towards the rise of illiberal governments. So any takers? Should it be that, I mean, Andy essentially said, well, we shouldn't really worry about it too much because in essence, these governments moderate themselves from a security point of view. So I suppose, Andy, your prescription would be, we don't really need to do anything.
Well, I don't have a problem with a little bit of pressure here and there, but I don't think it's the major threat to Western security. And I think you should just overlook the stuff that's symbolic, like, the UN Compact on Migration, which isn't even legal, let alone binding, or things that are small, like inside sleazy deals that countries have with authoritarians. Everybody's got them. There's Nord Stream, there's Russian investment in Hungarian nuclear power plant, there's the US-Saudi relations. So, and focus just on the things that might be big. I think there are exceptional issues that need to be managed. So migration is one, not because countries disagree in reality at all about keeping migrants out. They all want to do that, and it doesn't really matter whether you're right or left or there's no right-wing party at all. But Justin Guest said in the last panel, I think correctly, that it's hard to have a sensible European policy of sharing migrants. That's not going to increase greatly the number of migrants that you can let in, actually, but it will make it politically more palatable for countries to do that. So that's harder, and that's worth working on. And then there's Brexit, which in itself was a big thing, even though it is not going to be repeated, because Britain was a very exceptional case. And so I think it was worth fighting Brexit, and I think it's worth bargaining hard against Brexit, and I think it's worth trying to make sure that it doesn't get repeated elsewhere. But I think overreaction against this kind of thing and a kind of perfectionism that people impose on these regimes that they don't impose on themselves or others it's not that it's wrong exactly, but it's misplaced policy priorities. There are many more important things to be spending our time trying to generate cooperation about.
Mark, I can jump in too. So I guess I maybe deviate from Andy a little bit in the sense, especially on the security front, in the sense that I appreciate Andy's point about it's really hard for these right-wing populist parties to advance some sort of deviation from the status quo or to lead a real shift in policy priorities. But I think especially when it comes to NATO and the consensus-based institutions that are so important, it only takes one country to veto or to slow down decision-making. And that's where I think, one reason why I think the adherence to the liberal democratic values remains really important. And so there are things in the NATO context, although NATO has fewer tools to address this, that there are things that NATO can do, and multiple reports. And I see Rachel Ellahus is online. She wrote a fantastic piece on this recently, but in the report by Nick Burns and Doug Lute, and I think it was in the reflection group led by Wes Mitchell, people have taken on this issue about what NATO's role should be in upholding liberal democratic values. And one really good idea that I think is floating and bouncing around that will hopefully gain some traction is at least to kind of elevate and recommit to the principles, including democracy within the NATO institution. And people have talked about, well, maybe there should be some sort of annual report that annually reports on the ability of individual member states to uphold the principles that they have all signed on to, and that there should then be incentives to uphold them as well as costs for those member states who aren't adhering to them. And so I think people have talked about, including Rachel in her piece, incentives like NATO leadership positions, facility placement, ministerial locations, and then as well as some costs, which could be things like suspending member states from NATO military exercises or denying access to training and common infrastructure funding. So maybe that fits in with what Andy is saying, is not over prioritizing the issue, but making sure that it remains on the agenda, and then trying to create incentives, an incentive structure to help encourage member states to adhere. Because just going back to the NATO, allies, the organization is a military one, but it also is an institution that's founded on a combination of shared principles and democratic institutions. And so it's really important to not let that focus slip away from these institutions, and to structure incentives that make sure that those values are upheld.
Anyone else want to talk
Yeah,
about it?
outside of the NATO context, and I completely agree with everything that Andrea has said, and to echo some of what has been said in Rachel's paper as well. I think outside of NATO, there's also steps that we can be taking as a transatlantic community to strengthen democracy within our societies that in a way kind of strengthens our defenses from authoritarian interference. And one big area I see is on the anti-corruption agenda. This is something that I think has a lot of political support right now within the new US administration and also in different parts of Europe. So strengthening our mechanisms against money laundering, looking at tax havens and tax evasion statuses and ways to show that democracy can deliver for its people and that this model is not, corrupt nor capable of being taken advantage of by kleptocratic actors internally and those in Russia or elsewhere. I think there's a lot of room for an anti-corruption agenda that we should be carrying out transatlantically at the EU level and at the EU member state level. And again, I think there's a fair amount of political support for that, just a way to strengthen our own model internally at a time when it's really challenged from authoritarian actors from without as well.
Would challenge one thing about that. I'm in favor of anti-corruption very strongly, and have, as a student of the EU, have spent a lot of time pressing EU policymakers on this issue. The baddies there are not the extreme right governments, right? The baddies are people like Britain that harbors all this money, Germany that sends a lot of it to places. And the real barriers to doing something about that are in the allies we consider good allies, not these people. And similarly with democracy, I think it's very important to make a distinction between actions governments take to degrade democracy, other than having crummy constitutions like our own, and simply being an extreme right or perceived as an extreme right government, which is a harder thing to police and harder to measure.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add something. Yeah, that's what I was thinking also when Torrey was speaking, that indeed it's not the far right that wouldn't necessarily, anti-corruption wouldn't be something the far right would necessarily be against. I was taken with what Andy was saying, because I was thinking that in fact it's true. There's very little written on international security in the far right and in an international policy, or by definition, they're nationalists. But I really think one of the important points that he brought up is this issue of migration. And migration, is a real problem. And one would think that there could be some solution to it somewhere that's humane for both those who are refugees or immigrants. Yes, I agree. That's Andy shaking his head. And yet here we are. And it is one of the most morally charged debates. I mean, I've been at many more conferences where people talk about migration than international security. And there's almost a barrier to speech if one says we need a policy that's pragmatic in some way, but takes care of everybody. So, I mean, I think there are those kinds of issues, as Andy said, and I agree with him on this, that one could actually, put some emotional and intellectual and institutional focus on. And this is something that the US presumably could do, but it's complicated. And Macron now is doing all sorts of weird things about migrate. I mean, he started a sort of a virtual culture war against the US. It makes, the whole thing makes, it needs some rationality, it's all. And these issues are very, they intertwine in various ways.
So the defeat of Donald Trump, does that affect this situation at all? Can anyone on this panel imagine a situation in which right-wing populism recedes in Europe? And if so, what would make that happen?
If I say something about this, because I really didn't, I said my preferred term is right nationalism. And I think that we have too much of a notion that nationalism is a bad thing. And there have been a lot of political science. Andreas Wimmer, I'm sure you know, I've been writing that, and there was a whole issue of foreign affairs on this, that, nationalism could be good in some ways. And I think that if we sort of think, and the populist definition is, it's a non-definition in many ways. And I think that we as academics and people who are interested in this sort of thing need to think more carefully about this whole notion of our assumptions that nationalism is the sort of default bad position, and try to figure out, it's no accident that these right-wing populists aren't that interested in foreign policy in the end. Because most of the things that they talk about are all basically specific to the territorially bordered nation state. And I think that's something we really need to think about. And I'm not sure if it's just a nomenclature issue, and maybe the better question is, when will nationalism disappear and when will we be truly global and international and all these other things? But I'll leave it.
Others?
Maybe just to chime in, the one interesting thing is kind of an interesting thought exercise. So in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, when Europe kind of was a little bit, so they were a little bit slow out of the gates, and then they were doing quite better than the United States. And you saw in places like Germany, Angela Merkel's support went way up initially, and in Italy, Salvini's support went down, and there was kind of a resurgence of trust in mainstream political parties and established parties, and there was less kind of public support for some of these populist actors. There was a moment in time where we were all wondering, I think, if COVID was going to be the end of populism and a return to the belief in science and highly functioning government. So that has faded a little bit. I think since then we're on a different trajectory, but I think a lot of it comes back to the performance of political parties and the ability of the EU to deliver for its citizens, and especially for middle classes, policies that will address some of the root causes of this inequality, maybe better solutions to the migration issue. I mean, I think you could imagine a world in which this populism will recede, but a lot of it, and as we're hearing, from this administration, Joe Biden's administration, about, policies for a middle class. And so in my mind, it's a lot about the ability of mainstream political parties to deliver and to perform and to execute and be responsive to its citizens. And that, I think, would in many ways drain support for some of the especially far right parties. I know that's I don't know how divorced that is from reality, but there was a glimmer of it there, I think, for a moment at a point during the COVID pandemic, where we thought maybe this was going to take the air out of the populists and see a return to the belief in science and competent mainstream political parties.
Well, our colleague Raffaella Donziger here at Princeton has done interesting work on this. And I think what she points out is that the moderate parties are in a dilemma on the migration issue, at least, because the solution in a way is obvious. The politically stable, least bad option is to close borders, but have a credible and controlled process of letting some people in and treat them well once they get here. Right? I mean, that would be, but the problem is that you can't really state that clearly on the left because it's too closed. And you can't state it clearly on the right because it's too open. And so either way that a moderate party moves, it gets punished. So they end up saying better to duck this issue because we don't talk about it. But the problem with ducking it is then the radical right comes along and says, well, here's this big issue and nobody's saying something, even if in fact you look at the behavior of left-wing governments, be it Obama, be it Hollande, be it any of these people, and they're actually pretty restrictionist. So you can imagine where you want to get, but politically how to get there seems to be difficult because the moderate parties aren't credible. And I think Kishi who said in the last session that you could imagine a situation in which slowly Western governments would gain back their credibility on the migration issue. And if they did that, then at least based on our research, where that's 90% of the foreign policy guts of a right-wing appeal, you'd be in a much better position. But that's going to take time given what's happened in the last 10 years. both in the US and in Europe.
Okay. We would have time for one question from the audience, if there is one.
There's some in the chat.
Okay. So let me just see if I can get to them here. So here's one about a common European army and how that resonates with populist parties and the politician, excuse me, and the population in general. So suppose NATO can't survive, or suppose there's movement away from it. Is this something that populists or right-wing nationalists, however you want to define them, would support?
Well, if you're a Hill staffer and you're really worried about NATO spending 2%, you should love Marine Le Pen, because she claims she wants to double the French defense budget. It's a totally non-credible promise, but you know, but it's true. She doesn't, you know, she wants to go back to kind of General de Gaulle, where you're part of NATO, but you don't admit it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this was mentioned earlier, but just to kind of push back against the question, I mean, I think what we've seen from even far-right anti-EU parties in Europe has been a very pro-NATO stance, whether that be in Hungary or Poland or elsewhere. And so, yes, we've all talked about the challenges that we see within NATO due to democratic backsliding from within the alliance's ranks. That being said, there is a lot of support for this alliance, even across far-right parties. And maybe that actually gives the alliance some leverage to try to hold these governments accountable to the principles that they've signed up for. It's another way to think about it, but I actually am kind of bullish on the future of NATO, even in the context of the rising populism.
You're bullish on the future of NATO because?
No, I mean, its existence, its defense spending, the actual security cohesion that we see. I mean, even despite the challenges, we actually see pretty strong support from leaders and from populations in places that we're concerned about, like Poland, Hungary, Turkey, for this alliance.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was just reading even the Estonian kind of far right party. Is it EKRE? I forget what it is, but Eurosceptic, but really supportive of NATO. So that you know, arguing that the EU has underestimated the Russia threat, and so NATO therefore becomes the more important institution. So I guess I'm with Torrey.
And actually, it's interesting what happened in Estonia, because they were in government, and then when Trump lost the election, they kind of called it into question, and in 48 hours they were gone. You know, I mean, so you can see there are constraints there, and now Estonia is wonderfully run by 4 women. So it's you know, it's a different. These parties really face constraints, and how much they can buck this trend and get away with it.
So I was told by Bailey that we have to end pretty promptly at 3:15, and that's where we are right now. But I want to thank all of the panelists. You made great presentations. I learned a lot from them. I think everyone did, and I'm sure, you know, these questions are going to continue for a long time. So thanks.
Thanks. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.
In here, thanks a lot.
Thank you.